So, we just recently had a major come on through Central Florida in the form of CEO. I had a couple of friends go over there. I actually have a couple of friends who basically help run CEO and its streams, and I was unable to actually show up or participate in any capacity, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to stop myself from trying to engage in a little bit of the old fighting game discourse, especially considering the fact that I think I have a pretty unique view on it as someone who directly benefits from this conversation on some level. The concept of modern versus classic controls. For those who are unaware, obviously fighting games for the longest time have utilized controls that require things like motion inputs and a whole bunch of other different things that seem relatively restrictive or are just a giant barrier of entry for those of us who don't really have the time nor the know-how or the want to try to invest into learning these controls. I mean, I don't know how many people that I know of in my life that I've met that you hand them a controller and no matter what game they play, they're just mashing every single button on there just to have a good time. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it does mean that fighting games at their core are effectively very niche and restrictive. So this kind of push towards trying to modernize it in a literal sense by basically allowing people to play these controls without necessarily needing motion inputs for the most part, I think personally has been able to really get me more into fighting games more so than I ever have been. Because I have been playing fighting games on and off my entire life, but I just cannot wrap my head around the concept of certain combo paths, including all the motion inputs, because while there's a whole layer of Yomi, right? Yomi, I think is what they call it, the concept of essentially the inner battle of thoughts between you and your opponent as you try to figure out what they're going to do before they do it, and then react accordingly, if I remember correctly. I could be entirely wrong. Please go ahead and correct me in the comments. I am more than willing to, be called out for that, because as much as I have friends in the FGC, I have tons of friends in the FGC, I myself am merely a tourist. I will completely admit to that wholeheartedly. That being said, one of my favorite games I've played in some time has been Granblue Fantasy Versus Rising, I believe is the latest one, and I am in love with that. I am in love with the way that it allows me to essentially simplify the inputs, and so that I don't have to use barely any motion inputs as opposed to the cardinal directions that are there, because it basically allowed me to actually get into the nitty-gritty of the rest of what makes fighting games so fun. It genuinely allowed me to learn fundamentals and get things much more easily and be able to actively compete with people that normally I wouldn't be able to in any other capacity, because I'd be too busy just basically trying to put out a certain kind of motion input for a fireball or a DP or what have you. But now that we've essentially, this game does everything in its power to kind of simplify that, and it does so in a really smart way. By the moment you turn that off, you actually do less damage than somebody who's already using a technical input kind of control, where they themselves have to do motion inputs, which allow them to do more damage. I like that a lot. I think it's a really good kind of balancing thing, where it's like, yes, I'm going to be having a far more easier time than you. I'm not going to have to remember combo paths or anything like that. I can just kind of push buttons to my heart's content and do whatever I want to. And I have been able to actually sit down and enjoy that game and play it back to back, and even contend with some of my friends who, these guys are absolute fucking killers. They dominate in their field. These motherfuckers are some of the best. But what I love about it so much is that even with the simple addition of these controls in play, they are not brought down to my level. You know what I mean? They're not necessarily at a disadvantage, because at the end of the day, I myself am still working with just an approximate amount of knowledge of the video game. When I go up against somebody who's not only using a classic control input, but just knows the game better and can react better and knows the character and the matchup and everything, and can find a way to get me into their rhythm, I get my ass beat 9 times out of 10. And regardless whether or not they have told me that I am doing relatively well and I can actually go pretty far and have a decent modicum of skill in Granblue Versus, I still can't anti-air. I still don't know what the hell that means. I still get caught by so many things. I still don't know which combos are safe, which moves are safe, because now I just kind of at a point where the game is allowing me to push so many buttons. That's exactly what I'm doing, so I'm not really paying attention to stuff like that. So now I'm getting to a point where the technical aspect of it, the expertise that is required in order to just kind of get through the door is gone. And now the more fun part of the fighting games for me personally, the fundamentals, the mind games being played between each of the opponents, that is the stuff I have to start learning, and that is the thing that I'm really appreciating and loving so much with my journey in playing Grand Blue Fantasy Versus with my friends. And I love everything about it. And if that somehow can be translated to other video games, then by all means, I am completely on board. That doesn't mean that we need to get rid of classic controls. For one reason or another, I don't understand why developers feel the need to force individuals into not having to use motion inputs or anything like that, because I do believe that there is something that gets taken away from it. I do believe that those who are willing to grind it out and are willing to put that work and effort in are going to find an infinitely more rewarding experience than someone like me, who honestly, I'm getting old at this point. I'm like 35 next year, dog. I don't have enough time to kind of just be putting into learning a whole new subset of skills with gaming. I've relented. I put all of I spec'd everything into shooting games. I got GM and Marvel Rivals, okay? That's about as good as I'm going to be able to get it, as far as I'm concerned. I can't go above that. I've proved it to myself. Diamond in fucking Valorant, GM in fucking Marvel Rivals. I don't need to go any higher than that, alright? I'm decent at shooting games, but at fighting games, I am always going to be mediocre, and I have no qualms with that. And if I wanted to, it doesn't need to be the case, right? The ability to try to actively get better, do better is there for me. And I love the idea that on the other end of that spectrum, I can also just turn on classic controls, knowing what I know now about the modern use or the modern implementation of the controls I'm using, and can go through and do some really cool shit. But that opportunity needs to be there. That ability to do so needs to be there. It can't just be removed. And that is why I think at the end of the day, while I'm a huge advocate for modern controls, I also want classic controls to exist. Motion inputs do not need to go away. They just need to be put on the same kind of level, if not a little below classic controls for the most part. I really like the idea of a lot of the balancing that Grand Blue Fantasy Versus does. I'm particularly not the biggest fan of how Street Fighter handles it, because essentially what that means is that there's an entirely new tier list for how modern controls are handled for certain characters. For instance, I think E Honda Modern is like really fucking strong in comparison to somebody else who has a lot of their fucking really necessary moves just kind of deleted. I think a lot of the Shoto characters are actually pretty good on Modern as well. I'm not entirely familiar with Street Fighter 6 myself. Regardless, I'd like to hear what you guys think about this. What do you guys think about the Modern versus classic control debate? Is it something that you just want to go back and just get back to where fighting games were a niche and you don't give a fuck about whether or not people can play this game? Or are you completely fine with modern controls? Or are you like me and now you picked up a fighting game and you love it because you have the ability to not have to worry about motion inputs or anything like that? Let me know in the comments below. Like, favorite, comment, follow, all that bullshit. Thank you so much. Have a good one.